I am Henry Mitchell, 72 years old, standing beside an open grave with a handful of damp earth pressing into my palm. At my own son's funeral, while the priest was still reciting his final blessing over the mahogany casket, my daughter-in-law leaned into my shoulder and whispered that I had exactly 15 days to pack my belongings and vacate my own home. I did not scream. I did not argue. I simply smiled, nodded, dropped the dirt, and quietly walked away to pack a single leather bag. The next morning, she received a visitor she never anticipated, and the county police were pounding heavily on her front door. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to teach an arrogant person a devastating lesson they will never forget. The afternoon sky over the cemetery was a bruised purple, threatening a heavy downpour that never quite materialized. A damp, biting wind swept through the rows of granite headstones, chilling the dozens of mourners gathered around the rectangular pit where my son Matthew was about to be lowered into the earth. I stood at the very edge of the artificial green turf they use to cover the excavated dirt, holding my breath, trying to process the absolute unnaturalness of a father burying his only child. The priest was reading from a small leather-bound book, his voice a steady rhythmic drone that offered me absolutely no comfort. I focused entirely on the brass handles of the casket. I traced their intricate patterns with my eyes, trying desperately to anchor my mind to something physical, something real, because the reality of Matthew being inside that wooden box was simply too vast and terrible to comprehend. I had spent 40 years working as a civil engineer, building bridges and reinforcing foundations across the state. I understood how to bear weight. I understood stress and load and structural integrity. But the weight of this grief was entirely different. It was a crushing invisible force that threatened to collapse my chest with every shallow breath I took. As the priest closed his book and signaled for the family to step forward and offer their final respects, the heavy silence of the cemetery was broken by the sharp rhythmic clicking of high heels on the stone pathway. Vanessa stepped directly into my line of sight. She positioned herself between me and the grave, deliberately blocking my view of my son. The scent of her expensive floral perfume cut through the smell of the damp earth and crushed grass, a jarring artificial intrusion into a profoundly sacred space. She wore a tailored black designer dress that clung perfectly to her figure, an oversized pair of dark sunglasses concealing her eyes, and a wide-brimmed black hat that cast a deep shadow over her face. She did not look like a woman who had just lost her husband to a grueling, brutal battle with illness. She looked like a woman attending a high society gala, impatient for the main event to conclude. She leaned in close, her shoulder brushing against mine, pretending to offer a gesture of familial comfort for the benefit of the watching crowd. Instead of words of shared sorrow, her voice was a cold, calculated hiss that slithered directly into my ear. She told me that she had spoken with her attorneys that morning. She stated with absolute unwavering confidence that the entire family estate now belonged exclusively to her under the terms of Matthew's final will. She did not pause to let the shock register. She immediately issued her command, her tone devoid of any hesitation or empathy. She informed me that she was placing the property on the market by the end of the month. She said I had exactly 15 days to gather my personal effects and vacate the premises permanently. She suggested I look into a state-run assisted living facility, adding a cruel smirk to her final sentence, noting that a man of my advanced age did not need the burden of such a large house anyway. She then stepped back, adjusted her perfect posture, and turned to face the crowd, leaving me standing on the edge of the abyss, with her venom still echoing in my mind. The physical sensation of the betrayal was immediate and violently disorienting. The damp earth I had been holding in my right hand suddenly felt like burning coals. I stared at the side of her face, watching the subtle tightening of her jaw as she maintained her performance of the grieving widow for the audience behind us. I did not speak a single word. My silence was not born of weakness or confusion. It was the rapid, agonizing recalibration of my entire understanding of the past 10 years. My mind detached from the funeral service and plunged into a cold, meticulous review of the life I had constructed for them. I looked at the dark, luxurious fabric of the dress she was wearing. I recognized the texture and the cut. Just 4 days ago, while I was drowning in the administrative nightmare of arranging the funeral logistics, she had handed me an invoice for that exact dress. I had paid the credit card charge without a second thought, assuming it was a necessary expense to help her maintain her dignity during the worst week of our lives. I had funded her immaculate appearance for the very event where she planned to discard me. I shifted my gaze from Vanessa to the heavy oak casket resting on the lowering device. The memory of the day I handed Matthew the keys to the estate slammed into my chest. It was a crisp autumn morning 5 years ago. I had invited him into my study, poured us both a cup of black coffee, and slid the heavy brass key ring across my mahogany desk. I had told him that the house was his to manage his foundation to build upon. I wanted him to feel the pride of a homeowner, to have a secure fortress for his marriage to Vanessa, free from the crushing pressure of a monthly mortgage. I had willingly stepped back into the role of a silent guest in my own home, confining myself to the first-floor suite, paying the property taxes and the maintenance bills from my retirement accounts behind the scenes so they could build their savings. I had sacrificed my own comfort, my own territorial rights, as the patriarch of the family, entirely out of unconditional love for my son. I had believed I was nurturing a legacy. Standing over his grave, the terrible truth crystallized in my mind. That profound fatherly protection had not been respected. It had been weaponized. Vanessa had not seen a generous father providing a safety net. She had seen an obsolete, foolish old man relinquishing his power. She had watched me quietly pay the bills, fix the leaking roof, and maintain the grounds, and she had interpreted my quiet service as weakness. She had spent years convincing Matthew that my presence was a burden, slowly isolating me within the walls of the house I had purchased with 30 years of hard labor. And now, before the earth had even covered my son, she was moving to eradicate me completely from the life I had financed for her. The grief I felt for Matthew suddenly twisted, hardening into a sharp, crystalline clarity. The unconditional love that had blinded me was entirely gone, replaced by the cold, precise logic of an engineer looking at a structurally compromised building that needed to be demolished. I realized that my lifelong devotion had been systematically manipulated. The woman standing next to me was not family. She was a hostile entity who had calculated my destruction. I looked down at the clump of earth in my hand. I did not toss it onto the casket. I simply let my fingers open, allowing the dirt to fall silently onto the artificial green grass at my feet. I did not look at Vanessa again. I turned my back on the grave, on the murmuring crowd, and on the agonizing finality of the ceremony. I walked down the stone path toward the parking lot, my steps slow, deliberate, and perfectly measured. I did not rush. I did not project anger. I climbed into the driver's seat of my car, started the engine, and drove away from the cemetery. The roads leading back to the estate were deeply familiar, lined with ancient oak trees I had watched grow for decades, but the landscape now felt entirely alien. I was driving back to a battlefield disguised as a home. I pulled into the long gravel driveway and parked the car in front of the sweeping brick facade of the house. The silence inside was absolute and heavy. I walked through the grand foyer, my footsteps echoing off the hardwood floors. I moved through the living room, passing the expensive leather furniture I had purchased for them last Christmas. I walked into the massive kitchen, tracing my hand along the cool granite countertops. Every single object in the house was a testament to my financial sacrifice and her insatiable appetite for luxury. I did not feel any attachment to the physical items anymore. They were merely the bait in the trap she thought she had successfully set. I proceeded to my suite on the first floor. I pulled a single worn leather duffel bag from the top shelf of my closet. I moved with absolute mechanical efficiency. I packed 3 changes of clothes, a small bag of toiletries, my essential medication, and a thick blue folder containing my vital personal documents. I did not pack any photographs. I did not pack any sentimental trinkets. I left the silver-framed picture of Matthew on the nightstand, exactly where it was. Taking anything of emotional value would signal that I was retreating, that I was accepting defeat and fleeing into the night. I was not fleeing. I was intentionally vacating the structure to allow her to walk blindly into the blast radius. I zipped the duffel bag closed and carried it back out to the kitchen. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my heavy brass keyring. I carefully detached the 3 keys that granted access to the front door, the back patio, and the detached garage. I placed them squarely in the center of the kitchen island, ensuring the metal made a sharp, definitive clicking sound against the stone surface. The keys sat there under the recessed lighting, a physical manifestation of my total compliance to her demand. Anyone looking at that scene would conclude that the old man had simply surrendered, broken by grief and intimidation, scurrying away to find a corner to die in. I hoisted the duffel bag over my shoulder, walked out the front door, and pulled it firmly shut behind me. The heavy lock clicked into place. I walked down the porch steps, got back into my car, and shifted into drive. I did not look in the rearview mirror as I navigated down the winding driveway and merged onto the highway. The night sky was completely black now, the impending storm finally breaking, sending heavy sheets of rain lashing against the windshield. I drove steadily toward a cheap motel on the outskirts of the county, leaving my entire life behind me. My compliance was absolute flawless and utterly deceptive. Vanessa wanted the house. I had given it to her, but she had no idea that the ground she was standing on did not belong to her, and the massive machinery of consequence was already silently grinding into motion. The thin motel curtains did little to block the harsh morning sunlight. I sat at the small veneer table holding a cup of bitter black coffee. My phone rested flat against the surface. The screen glowed with the live feed from the discreet security cameras I had installed around the estate years ago. Matthew knew about them, but Vanessa never paid enough attention to notice the small black domes tucked under the eaves and nestled in the foyer chandelier. I watched her arrive at the house just after 8 in the morning. She did not look like a grieving widow returning to a house of mourning. She practically marched up the front steps, her posture radiating a triumphant energy. She opened the front door and stepped into the grand foyer. I could see her looking around the empty space, absorbing the silence. Then she walked directly into the kitchen and stopped at the central island. The 3 brass keys sat exactly where I had left them, under the recessed lighting. She picked them up and held them dangling from her manicured fingers. I watched her lips curl into a wide, satisfied smile. She threw her head back and let out a laugh that the silent audio feed could not capture, but her body language spoke volumes. She believed she had won. She believed she had broken a 72-year-old man with a single cruel whisper at a gravesite. She picked up her phone and immediately began making calls, her free hand sweeping across the granite countertops, as if she were blessing her newly conquered territory. She was surveying the kingdom she believed she had just inherited through sheer intimidation. She walked from room to room, turning on every single light switch, adjusting the thermostat to an expensive temperature and opening the expensive silk drapes to let the sunlight flood the grand living room. She was practically vibrating with the thrill of her perceived victory. She did not waste a single moment mourning her husband. Less than an hour after she discovered the keys, a large white commercial van pulled into the circular driveway. The side panels bore the bold red lettering of a local locksmith company. I watched the technician carry his heavy metal toolboxes up the front steps. Vanessa met him at the door, her arms crossed, a look of absolute authority painted on her face. She pointed directly at the heavy brass lock on the front door. That lock was custom-made. I had ordered it from a foundry in Boston 30 years ago to ensure the house was secure for my family. I watched through the high-definition camera feed as the technician pulled out a heavy-duty drill. He pressed the metal bit against the brass cylinder and pulled the trigger. plumes of metal shavings fell onto the welcome mat. It took him less than 10 minutes to destroy the lock I had carefully maintained for decades. He moved systematically through the house. He drilled out the back patio doors. He replaced the electronic keypad on the detached garage, ensuring that not even my vehicle could return to its designated spot. Vanessa trailed behind him the entire time, inspecting his work and nodding with approval. She was paying him extra for emergency service using the very funds I had deposited into their joint account just weeks prior. She was using my money to lock me out of my own home. I watched the heavy brass cylinders clatter against the hardwood floors, replaced by cheap, shiny aluminum hardware that she selected hastily from the back of the technician's van. By 10 in the morning, she had physically sealed her perceived fortress. She walked back to the kitchen and threw the old brass keys directly into the trash can. It was a symbolic execution of my presence in that house. But she was not finished securing her dominance. She needed an enforcer. Just before noon, a loud rusted pickup truck violently hopped the curb and parked directly on the pristine front lawn I had personally landscaped. I knew exactly who it was. The heavy driver's side door groaned open, and her younger brother stepped out onto the grass. He was a man approaching 40, who had never held a steady job in his entire adult life. He specialized in moving from one relative's couch to another, leaving a trail of empty beer bottles and borrowed money in his wake. Vanessa walked out onto the front porch and greeted him with open arms. He reached into the bed of his truck and pulled out 2 oversized black trash bags filled with his clothing, a cheap plastic cooler, and a battered guitar case he had never learned how to play. They walked into the house together. I switched the camera feed to the interior hallway. Vanessa did not lead him to the guest bedrooms on the 2nd floor. She led him directly toward the 1st floor master suite. My suite. The room where I had slept for the last 5 years, giving them the entire rest of the house to build their life. She opened the double doors and gestured for him to enter. He tossed his trash bags carelessly onto the floor. I watched him walk over to my custom-made mattress. He did not bother to take off his heavy work boots. He climbed directly onto the expensive duvet cover, stretching his legs out and crossing his arms behind his head. He looked around the room, examining the crown molding and the custom-built bookshelves with a look of unearned entitlement. Vanessa walked into the room carrying 2 bottles of expensive imported beer from the kitchen refrigerator. She handed one to her brother and raised the other in the air, proposing a toast to their newly acquired wealth. The foam spilled over the rims and dripped onto the hardwood floors, but neither of them cared to clean it up. They clinked the glass bottles together, laughing and drinking in the middle of my bedroom. She was treating the estate like a prize she had won in a lottery. She believed that moving her aggressive, unpredictable brother into my personal sanctuary would serve as a physical deterrent in case I somehow gathered the courage to return and demand my home back. She thought his presence would intimidate me. She thought changing the locks would finalize her ownership. Every single action she took that morning was driven by arrogance and greed. She was so blinded by her sudden rush of power that she never once stopped to consider the legal foundation of her actions. She never questioned why I had surrendered so easily. She never wondered why a man who had built his entire life around order and control would just pack a single bag and vanish into the night without a fight. I sat in the quiet motel room watching the entire spectacle unfold on the small, glowing screen. I did not feel a single trace of anger. Anger is an unpredictable emotion that leads to careless mistakes. I felt only a cold, profound sense of clarity. Every lock she destroyed, every beer she drank, every arrogant laugh she shared with her brother was simply another piece of evidence confirming she deserved exactly what was about to happen to her. I reached over and pressed the power button on my phone. The screen faded to black, cutting off the live feed of their pathetic celebration. I took a slow sip of my bitter coffee. The house was hers for now. Let her enjoy the cheap thrill of a stolen kingdom. She had successfully taken the bait, and now it was time for the jaws of the trap to snap shut. I remained seated in the dim light of my motel room, with my eyes fixed intently on the secondary security feed that monitored the heavy iron front gates of the estate. At exactly 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the heavy wooden front doors swung open, and Vanessa emerged. She had completely discarded the somber black mourning attire she wore to the cemetery just 24 hours prior. Instead, she was dressed in a sharp, tailored crimson business suit that screamed of corporate aggression and newfound wealth. She carried a thick, black leather portfolio tucked tightly under her right arm, her posture rigid and victorious. She marched down the stone steps toward her luxury sedan with the purposeful, predatory stride of a conqueror, heading directly to a coronation. I knew exactly where she was driving, and I knew exactly what was hidden inside that leather portfolio. By changing the locks and moving her belligerent brother into my personal sanctuary, she had only committed a minor civil offense. That was a petty annoyance meant to wound my pride. But what she was about to do next would cross a massive, irreversible legal threshold. She was leaving the realm of family disputes and driving directly into the iron jaws of the criminal justice system. The county clerk office is located inside a massive brutalist stone building situated in the center of the downtown district. It is a place of endless, meticulous bureaucracy, filled with exhausted citizens waiting in long, winding lines to file property taxes, marriage licenses, and complex zoning permits. Vanessa did not view herself as a regular citizen bound by the rules of society. Through the intricate network of public security cameras and the highly detailed timeline later provided to my attorney by the district prosecutor's office, I could perfectly visualize her exact movements. She pushed aggressively through the heavy glass double doors, entirely ignoring the metal detectors and the security guards stationed at the entrance. She bypassed the designated waiting area and refused to take a numbered ticket from the automated dispenser. She simply scanned the room, identified the most senior administrative clerk available, and marched straight toward the main processing counter. Her expensive heels clicked sharply against the polished linoleum floor, echoing loudly off the high vaulted ceilings and demanding the immediate attention of everyone in the silent room. She stood before the thick, bulletproof plexiglass partition, radiating an aura of absolute impatience and unearned superiority, treating the government building like her own personal administrative playground. The woman working behind the main counter was a veteran civil servant named Martha, who had meticulously processed county property deeds for over 30 years. Martha had seen every type of financial fraud, every desperate criminal scheme, and every arrogant, entitled heir that had ever walked through those courthouse doors. Vanessa did not see a seasoned legal professional standing behind the glass. She saw a minor obstacle. She saw a low-level public employee standing between her and her stolen millions. Vanessa slapped the heavy leather portfolio onto the marble counter with a loud, aggressive thud that made the surrounding citizens jump. She did not offer a polite greeting or wait her turn. She simply declared her demands. She stated loudly that she was the sole executor of the Matthew Mitchell estate, and she required the immediate transfer of the primary residential property into her maiden name. Martha, maintaining the stoic, cold composure of a veteran public servant, calmly asked Vanessa to lower her voice and produce the necessary verified legal paperwork. Vanessa scoffed, letting out a sharp sound of profound disrespect, and violently unzipped the leather portfolio. She pulled out a crisp, heavy piece of parchment paper and slid it forcefully under the narrow gap in the plexiglass partition. It was a quitclaim deed. I knew exactly what that specific document looked like because I had seen it resting on my son's desk during his final weeks. It was the physical manifestation of my son's darkest moment of weakness. During his final agonizing months when the medical bills were mounting and his physical energy was failing, Vanessa had relentlessly pressured him to secure her financial future. She had convinced him that I would throw her out onto the street the very moment his heart stopped beating. Under the crushing weight of terminal illness and her daily psychological manipulation, Matthew had typed up that document. But the property did not belong to him, so he could not legally transfer it. In a desperate, feverish attempt to appease her relentless greed, he had forged my signature at the bottom of the page. He had never filed it because he was consumed by profound guilt. But Vanessa had found it after he died, and in her boundless arrogance she believed it was her golden ticket to absolute wealth. She tapped her perfectly manicured fingernail directly against the forged signature of my name. She leaned forward, pressing her face dangerously close to the plexiglass, and instructed Martha to expedite the official filing process immediately. She loudly claimed she had high-value buyers waiting to view the property that very afternoon, and she could not afford any bureaucratic delays from incompetent government workers. She was utilizing the tragedy of her husband's recent death as a blunt instrument for intimidation, hoping the older clerk would be too sympathetic or too terrified to look closely at the paperwork. She spoke with the practiced rapid cadence of someone who was entirely accustomed to bullying service workers into absolute submission. Martha did not flinch, and she did not rush. She slowly picked up the forged document, adjusted her reading glasses, and began to scrutinize the blue ink. She looked at the date of the notary stamp. She looked at the misspelled legal description of the property boundaries, which was a subtle, tragic error Matthew had made in his severely medicated state. Vanessa grew visibly agitated by the silent delay. She began to tap her foot rapidly against the linoleum, demanding to speak to the county registrar, and threatening to have Martha fired for insubordination. She raised her voice, causing dozens of people in the waiting area to turn and stare in shock. She was putting on a theatrical display of righteous indignation, firmly believing that whoever screamed the loudest automatically won the argument. Every word she spoke and every threat she issued was permanently recorded on the courthouse security tapes. Martha remained utterly silent under the heavy barrage of insults. She maintained a perfectly neutral expression, calmly picked up her heavy date stamp, and pressed it firmly onto the top right corner of the forged deed. By demanding that document be officially recorded, Vanessa was legally asserting that she believed the signature was genuine. She was officially uttering a forged instrument with the explicit intent to commit massive real estate fraud. Martha slid the document onto the glass surface of her digital scanner. Vanessa let out a heavy sigh of relief, crossing her arms and smiling a predatory smile, assuming her aggressive tactics had successfully terrified the old clerk into compliance. She believed the $1 million asset was now safely secured in her name, entirely unaware that the piece of paper she had just submitted was a direct, unredeemable ticket to a federal penitentiary. The heavy digital scanner on the desk pulled the thick parchment paper through its internal rollers with a slow, mechanical hum. I knew the exact specifications of that county database system because my attorney Andrew Barnes and I had spent 3 hours the previous afternoon ensuring the digital tripwires were perfectly calibrated. When I originally transferred the family estate into a blind corporate trust 2 decades ago, I embedded a strict security protocol to prevent unauthorized title transfers. Any attempt to file a deed bearing my name without the corresponding cryptographic clearance from my legal counsel would not merely be rejected by the system. It would trigger an automatic fraud alert across the entire municipal network. I sat in my quiet motel room visualizing the invisible data packets traveling from the workstation directly into the central county servers. Vanessa stood on the other side of the bulletproof glass, entirely oblivious to the catastrophic chain reaction she had just initiated. She crossed her arms over her expensive crimson jacket and tapped her manicured fingers against her elbows. She was practically vibrating with the anticipation of impending wealth. She stared intently at the small computer monitor facing the clerk, fully expecting to see the green confirmation text that would finalize her absolute control over my family legacy. The mechanical hum of the scanner ceased as the document slid smoothly into the output tray. Martha, the veteran clerk, clicked her computer mouse to complete the digital attachment and submit the file to the central registry. For 3 agonizing seconds, absolutely nothing happened. The standard county software interface, which usually processed title transfers in a matter of moments, simply froze. A small gray loading circle appeared in the center of the screen, spinning endlessly against a stark white background. Vanessa let out a loud, dramatic sigh of frustration. She leaned forward and loudly complained about the pathetic state of government technology, suggesting with extreme arrogance that her tax dollars should be paying for faster internet servers. She assumed it was a routine bureaucratic delay. She assumed she was still the most powerful and important person in the room. But the delay was not a glitch in the software. The delay was the central server running the forged signature against the ironclad parameters of my corporate trust. The digital system was silently verifying the catastrophic discrepancy between the fraudulent document she had submitted and the legal reality I had constructed. Suddenly, the spinning gray circle vanished. The standard blue and white interface of the county property database was instantly replaced by a solid wall of bright crimson light. The sudden change in illumination reflected sharply off the thick reading glasses worn by the clerk. The computer screen was completely locked. A bold white text box appeared in the center of the red background, displaying a severe terminal warning. It cited a specific federal banking code indicating a high-level title dispute and a suspected felony forgery attempt involving a protected corporate asset. It explicitly instructed the attending clerk to secure the physical document immediately and notify law enforcement without alarming the submitting party. Martha had processed thousands of routine property deeds in her 30-year career at the courthouse. She had dealt with missing signatures, expired notary stamps, and incorrect boundary lines. But she had rarely seen the central system completely lock down a workstation with a severe federal fraud warning. The subtle shift in the demeanor of the older clerk was a masterclass in professional composure. She did not gasp in shock. She did not look up at Vanessa with wide, panicked eyes. She simply stopped typing. She slowly pulled her hands away from the computer keyboard and rested them flat on her lap, entirely out of sight. Her posture straightened slightly, shifting from the relaxed slump of an exhausted government employee to the rigid, alert stance of a woman who realizes she is standing 3 feet away from a dangerous criminal. Without breaking eye contact with the glaring red screen, she subtly slid her right knee sideways under the heavy wooden desk. She found the small square panic button mounted beneath the counter and pressed it firmly, holding it down for 3 full seconds. The button did not trigger loud, audible alarms or flashing lights in the main lobby. It sent a silent priority alert directly to the armed deputies stationed at the courthouse security checkpoint, indicating a high-threat situation at her specific window. Vanessa noticed the sudden silence. She stopped tapping her fingers and leaned closer to the plexiglass partition, trying to see the screen. She demanded to know what was taking so long. She asked if the machine was broken and aggressively insisted that the clerk print out a physical receipt immediately. She was losing her patience, entirely unaware that she had already lost her freedom. Martha finally looked up from the frozen computer monitor. The tone of her voice had completely changed. The annoyed customer service cadence was gone completely, replaced by a cold, flat neutrality. She informed Vanessa that the system was running a mandatory secondary verification check and requested that she wait just another moment. She then smoothly reached across her desk, picked up the physical forged quitclaim deed, and placed it directly into a locked drawer, turning the key with a definitive metallic click. Vanessa immediately protested this action. She slammed her open palm flat against the bulletproof glass and shouted that the document belonged to her. She demanded the clerk return the paperwork immediately, threatening to call her imaginary high-powered attorneys to sue the entire county for incompetence and emotional distress. Her loud, aggressive demands echoed through the quiet waiting area, drawing the horrified stares of every citizen in the room. But her reign of intimidation was officially over. The heavy wooden double doors at the far end of the hallway swung open with tremendous force. 2 uniformed county sheriff deputies walked briskly into the room, their hands resting cautiously on their heavy duty belts. They did not pause to scan the crowd or ask for directions. They moved with absolute precision directly toward the property recording counter. Vanessa heard the heavy thud of their tactical boots approaching from behind, She turned around, her face flushed with anger, fully prepared to demand that the officers arrest the clerk for stealing her property. She opened her mouth to issue a command, but the words died instantly in her throat. The lead deputy, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a stern, uncompromising expression, stepped directly into her personal space. He did not ask her for her name or inquire about the nature of the disturbance. He looked directly into her eyes and instructed her to step away from the counter and place both of her hands flat on the wall behind her. The absolute authority in his deep voice left no room for argument or negotiation. Vanessa froze completely. The angry crimson color drained entirely from her face, leaving her skin a pale, sickly white. Her perfectly tailored business suit suddenly looked like a cheap costume she had stolen for a terrible play. The aggressive posture, the venomous tone, the absolute certainty of her impending victory, all of it evaporated in a single devastating second. She looked back at the glass partition, seeking some form of explanation or rescue, but the clerk had already stepped away from the window. Vanessa looked back at the officers, her eyes wide with a sudden, profound terror as the heavy steel handcuffs were unclipped from the belt of the deputy. The massive, invincible fortress of arrogance she had built over the past decade shattered completely into a million irreparable pieces as the cold metal rings snapped tightly around her wrists, locking her fate. The walls of the motel room were painted a sterile, faded yellow that reminded me of old institutional hallways. The air conditioning unit rattled continuously below the single window, fighting a losing battle against the heavy afternoon humidity. I sat perfectly still in a stiff floral armchair, with my hands folded loosely on my lap. The television remained off. The silence in the small room was profound, but it was not the silence of defeat. It was the comfortable, heavy silence of a man who has finished a grueling mathematical equation and is simply waiting for the final numbers to align on the page. I am a civil engineer by trade. My entire life has been defined by the rigid principles of cause and effect, by measuring load-bearing capacities and calculating the exact point at which a physical structure will fail under pressure. When you build a trap designed to catch a predator, you do not stand over it nervously wringing your hands. You set the mechanical mechanism, you secure the heavy anchor points, and you step away into the shadows. I had stepped away. I was sitting 3 towns over in a room that cost $40 a night, completely detached from the opulent mansion I had built with my own hands and my own sweat. I did not feel any anxiety about the loss of my physical property. The custom woodwork, the imported marble, and the expensive glass meant absolutely nothing to me anymore. They were just raw materials. The only thing that mattered now was the absolute certainty of the legal mechanism I had set into motion. At precisely 1:45 in the afternoon, the cell phone resting on the cheap laminate table began to vibrate. The screen illuminated in the dim room, displaying the name Andrew Barnes. Andrew was not just a corporate lawyer, he was a trusted confidant who had helped me structure my entire financial life over the past 3 decades. He possessed a legal mind that was as cold and precise as a titanium vault. I reached out and answered the call, putting the phone to my ear. I did not ask any desperate questions or demand immediate answers. I simply breathed in and said hello. Andrew's voice came through the small speaker, completely devoid of any dramatic inflection or excitement. He sounded exactly like a man reading a routine weather report over the radio. He informed me that the county clerk database system had just registered a severe localized lockdown protocol at the main downtown courthouse. The digital tripwire we had meticulously designed and buried deep within the county registry network had been successfully tripped. He told me that Vanessa had walked right up to the main public counter and actively submitted the forged quitclaim deed. She had done so with the explicit aggressive demand that it be recorded immediately into the public record. By executing that single action, she had legally crossed an unredeemable threshold. She had moved from simply harboring a fraudulent document in a private drawer to actively uttering a forged instrument against a protected corporate trust. Andrew confirmed that the veteran clerk had recognized the system warning and pressed the silent security alarm beneath her desk. The armed sheriff deputies had detained Vanessa inside the building before she could even process what was happening, and the forged parchment was already secured in a locked government evidence drawer. The trap had not merely snapped shut around her ankle, it had locked permanently. I thanked Andrew for his diligent work and ended the call, setting the phone back down onto the table with a soft click. I leaned back against the stiff fabric of the armchair and closed my eyes, allowing the reality of the situation to settle over me. The machinery of the criminal justice system is incredibly slow and frustrating when you are trying to push it forward from the outside. However, it is terrifyingly swift and absolute when you trigger a federal banking and real estate alert from the inside. I had not laid a single finger on her perfectly tailored clothes. I had not raised my voice or engaged in a petty, humiliating shouting match at the cemetery. I had simply stepped out of her way, removed my protective presence, and allowed her own boundless arrogance to carry her straight over the edge of the legal cliff. She firmly believed that because I was old and visibly grieving, I was naturally weak and completely defenseless. She completely misunderstood the fundamental nature of my silence. My silence was not surrender. My silence was the poured concrete foundation of her total ruin. By aggressively changing the locks and moving her belligerent brother into the house, she had committed criminal trespassing against a corporate entity. By attempting to file that specific deed, she had attempted to defraud that same powerful entity. She had woven her own thick noose with the dark threads of her insatiable greed. I stood up from the chair and walked over to the small window, pulling back the thin curtain to look out into the wet parking lot. The heavy rain had finally stopped, leaving the cracked asphalt slick and dark under the gray sky. I knew exactly what was happening to her at that exact moment. The deputies were likely processing her fingerprints in a cold, concrete room, taking her mugshot, and systematically stripping away the expensive accessories she used to project her false superiority. But I also knew her personality too well to believe this was the end of the conflict. A cornered predator is always the most dangerous and unpredictable. She would inevitably use her remaining funds to post bail. She would return to the estate feeling deeply bruised, humiliated, and stripped of her immediate prize. She would return with a desperate, burning vengeance. She would quickly realize the physical house was entirely out of her reach, protected by walls of legal armor she could never pierce. Therefore, she would immediately look for another source of wealth to pillage before her world collapsed completely. She would turn her predatory gaze toward the corporate business accounts, and when she finally reached her hand into that dark water, I would be waiting there to pull her under. I opened the secure application on my tablet to view the primary camera feed overlooking the front gates of my estate. The afternoon sun was beginning to cast long, heavy shadows across the pristine, manicured lawn. The profound silence of the property was abruptly shattered by the violent crunching of gravel. Two sleek county police cruisers turned sharply onto the long, winding driveway. Their emergency roof lights were fully activated, sending bright, aggressive flashes of red and blue light bouncing violently against the red brick facade of the house. They did not use their sirens, choosing instead a swift and completely tactical approach. The heavy vehicles came to a sudden halt directly in front of the sweeping concrete steps. 4 uniformed officers stepped out of the cruisers. They moved with coordinated military precision, their hands resting cautiously on their heavy duty belts. They quickly fanned out across the front lawn, establishing a secure operational perimeter around the property. 2 of the officers proceeded directly up the front steps toward the heavy double doors. They did not press the decorative brass doorbell. Instead, the lead officer raised his heavy fist and pounded rhythmically against the solid wood. The commanding sound echoed loudly through the empty foyer, captured perfectly by the internal microphones of my hidden security system. Inside the master suite on the first floor, the unexpected noise startled Vanessa's brother awake. The secondary camera feed in the hallway showed him stumbling out of my personal bedroom, wearing a stained gray undershirt and rumpled denim jeans. He carried a half-empty bottle of imported beer in his left hand, completely treating my home like a cheap roadside tavern. He looked disoriented and visibly angry at the sudden disturbance to his afternoon nap. He lumbered heavily down the hardwood hallway, muttering bitter complaints to himself. He reached the foyer and forcefully yanked the front door open. He fully expected to intimidate a lost delivery driver, or perhaps a nosy neighborhood association member. Instead, he found himself standing face to face with two imposing law enforcement officers. The lead officer immediately demanded his full legal name and official identification. The brother puffed out his chest and adopted a highly aggressive, confrontational stance. He slurred his words loudly, declaring that he did not have to show them absolutely anything because his sister was the new owner of the massive house. He aggressively pointed his thick finger directly at the chest of the lead officer and ordered the police to get off his private property immediately. The officer remained perfectly calm and professional. He clearly informed the belligerent man that the property was legally owned and operated by a registered corporate trust and that he was officially considered a hostile criminal trespasser. The brother laughed, a harsh, mocking sound of pure ignorance, and attempted to forcefully slam the heavy wooden door directly in the officer's face. It was a spectacular and painful mistake. The lead officer thrust his heavy tactical boot forward, instantly blocking the door from closing. In one fluid, highly trained motion, he grabbed the brother's extended right arm, twisted it sharply behind his back, and shoved him hard against the exterior brick wall of the porch. The glass beer bottle slipped from his fingers and shattered loudly onto the welcome mat, sending foam and broken glass scattering across the stone. The sharp metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs echoed crisply through the digital audio feed as the brother was completely immobilized. He immediately began to shout desperate profanities, thrashing his heavy body back and forth in a futile attempt to escape, but the two officers easily overpowered him. They marched him roughly down the front concrete steps and shoved him unceremoniously into the back of the primary police cruiser, slamming the heavy door shut on his pathetic, humiliated protests. Less than 10 minutes after her brother was secured in the vehicle, a sleek black luxury sedan came tearing up the driveway at a completely reckless speed. It was Vanessa. She had just utilized a massive sum of emergency cash to post bail and secure her temporary release from the downtown courthouse holding cell. She was driving erratically, her mind entirely consumed by a toxic, volatile mixture of absolute humiliation and blinding rage. She slammed her foot on the brakes, causing the heavy sedan to skid violently across the loose gravel and stop just a few inches away from the rear bumper of the second police cruiser. She threw her car door open and stormed out onto the driveway. Her expensive crimson business suit was heavily wrinkled from her time in the holding cell, and her perfectly styled hair was a disheveled mess. She immediately saw her brother trapped in the back of the police vehicle, and she completely lost whatever fragile remaining grip she had on her sanity. She marched directly toward the lead officer, screaming at the absolute top of her lungs. She demanded to know exactly why her brother was locked in a cage like an animal. She aggressively claimed that she was the sole legal executor of the estate and that the police were participating in a massive illegal harassment campaign orchestrated by a bitter, delusional old man. The lead officer did not flinch or raise his voice to match her hysterical, chaotic screaming. He simply stood tall and completely blocked her physical path to the cruiser. He calmly reached into the pocket of his tactical vest, pulled out a folded piece of official paper, and held it up directly in front of her face. It was a newly issued arrest warrant. He informed her with absolute cold clarity that while she may have temporarily posted bail for the preliminary fraud charges at the courthouse, she was now being formally charged with directing a criminal break-in and ordering the malicious destruction of private property at a protected corporate address. Vanessa stopped screaming instantly. The air seemed to leave her lungs entirely. She stared blankly at the stamped arrest warrant as the officer calmly reached to his belt for his own pair of handcuffs. He instructed her to turn around and place her hands behind her back. As the cold metal rings locked tightly around her wrists for the second time that day, he began to recite her Miranda rights. His steady, authoritative voice echoed across the manicured lawn, informing her that she had the right to remain silent as she watched her entire stolen kingdom crumble into dust around her. As a civil engineer, I spent my entire career obsessing over the structural integrity of foundations. I understood that no matter how beautiful a building appeared on the outside, it would inevitably collapse if the concrete poured deep beneath the earth was compromised. When my late wife and I purchased the sprawling estate 20 years ago, I approached the acquisition with the exact same mindset. I was not merely buying a piece of prime real estate. I was constructing a permanent, multi-generational fortress for my family. The world is full of sudden, unpredictable disasters. Markets crash, lawsuits materialize out of thin air, and predatory individuals constantly circle anyone who has managed to accumulate a measure of wealth. I refused to leave the safety of my wife and my young son exposed to the chaotic whims of fate. Therefore, I did not simply sign my name on a standard deed. I sat down with my attorney, Andrew Barnes, and we spent months meticulously drafting the framework for an irrevocable blind corporate trust. The legal structure we created was an absolute masterpiece of defensive engineering. The estate was completely absorbed by the corporate entity. I was listed as the managing director with sole operational authority, but my personal name was entirely removed from the public property records. If I was ever sued in a catastrophic accident, my home could never be liquidated. If I suffered a devastating medical emergency, the hospital could never place a lien against the brick walls that sheltered my family. It was an invisible, impenetrable shield. When my wife passed away a few years later, that trust ensured her legacy remained entirely untouched. And when Matthew grew into a man and married Vanessa, I allowed him to move into the primary residence under a carefully constructed illusion. I handed him the keys and told him the house was his to manage. I wanted him to feel the heavy pride of providing for his new wife. I wanted to give him the solid ground he needed to build his own confidence. But he never legally owned a single blade of grass on that property. He was essentially a permanent, deeply loved tenant of the corporate trust. My strategy of silent protection contained one fatal psychological flaw. I never anticipated the boundless, manipulative greed of the woman he chose to marry. Vanessa was not satisfied with living rent-free in a $1 million mansion. She demanded absolute total control. She viewed my continued presence in the first-floor suite as a constant insulting reminder that she was not the supreme ruler of the kingdom. As Matthew grew sicker, her relentless demands for financial supremacy escalated into a daily campaign of psychological warfare against a dying man. She constantly whispered in his ear that I was plotting to evict her the moment he passed away. She convinced my exhausted, frightened son that I was a threat to her survival. She demanded physical, documented proof that the estate belonged exclusively to them. She demanded a deed with his name on it, so she could immediately transfer it into her own name after his passing. I discovered the ultimate result of her cruelty purely by accident just 3 months before Matthew died. I had gone into his home office to retrieve a misplaced medical bill when I saw the heavy parchment paper sitting carelessly on his mahogany desk. It was a standard quitclaim deed downloaded from the internet. I recognized the basic formatting immediately, but the details filled in on the blank lines caused my heart to stop completely. The document claimed to transfer the entire estate from my name directly into his, and at the bottom of the page, resting above the printed letters of my name, was my own signature, perfectly copied in bright blue ink. It was an expert forgery, but I knew the subtle variations of my own handwriting. My son, my only child, had committed a felony against me. The physical shock of that discovery was worse than any illness I have ever endured. I stood in his quiet office holding the fraudulent paper, feeling the entire foundation of my family crumbling into dust. My initial instinct was to confront him immediately, to demand an explanation for the profound betrayal. But then I looked down the hallway and saw Matthew resting in his medical chair. His body was completely ravaged by the illness. His skin was pale, and his breathing was shallow and labored. He was a terrified, exhausted man who was desperately trying to buy a few moments of peace from his relentlessly demanding wife. He had forged my signature because he was too weak to fight her anymore, and he simply wanted the screaming to stop before he died. He was attempting to give her the world just so he could close his eyes in silence. The tragedy of his situation broke my heart far more than the forgery itself. Because I had built the corporate trust, I knew the deed was absolutely worthless. A forged signature cannot transfer an asset that the supposed signer does not even legally own. The piece of paper was a complete legal fiction. Therefore, I made the most agonizing decision of my entire life. I put the document back on his desk, exactly where I found it, and I walked away. I chose to bear the silent, excruciating knowledge of his crime. I absorbed the pain of his betrayal, so my son could die believing he had finally appeased his wife. I allowed him to leave this world with a fragile illusion of peace, completely unaware that the worthless piece of paper he left behind would become the exact instrument of her ultimate destruction. By bringing that forged document to the courthouse, Vanessa had not claimed an inheritance. She had unknowingly activated the very trap my son had accidentally built for her under the crushing pressure of her own greed. The heavy steel door of the county holding cell slammed shut, with a finality that should have broken her spirit completely. For the second time in less than 12 hours, Vanessa found herself sitting on a cold concrete bench, stripped of her designer accessories, and forced to face the harsh fluorescent reality of the criminal justice system. Any rational human being would have used that terrifying isolation to reflect on their disastrous choices. A normal person would have realized that the walls closing in around them were built entirely by their own arrogance. But Vanessa was not burdened by rationality or remorse. As she sat in that sterile room surrounded by the muffled sounds of the jail, the initial shock of her arrest quickly evaporated. It was rapidly replaced by a blinding white-hot rage. She did not blame herself for forging the document or attempting to steal a property she did not legally own. She blamed me. She convinced herself that I was a cruel, vindictive monster who had maliciously set a trap to humiliate a grieving widow. In her twisted reality, I was the villain who had stolen her rightful crown. It took her lawyers nearly 6 hours to arrange her release. Because she had violated the conditions of her initial bail by going directly to the estate and inciting a physical confrontation, the presiding judge significantly increased the financial penalty. To secure her freedom, she was forced to liquidate the remaining balance of the private emergency fund she had kept hidden from Matthew during their marriage. She handed over every last dollar of her stolen safety net to a predatory bail bondsman who looked at her with the exact same disgust she usually reserved for service workers. When she finally walked out of the massive concrete facility, the sun had already set. The damp night air offered no comfort. Her expensive crimson suit was ruined. Her hair was a tangled mess. She stood on the harsh pavement of the city sidewalk, completely exiled from the luxurious life she believed she deserved. She knew she could never return to the estate. The heavy brass locks were gone, but the invisible fortress I had built around the property was impenetrable. The police cruisers would be sitting at the end of the driveway, waiting for her to make another mistake. She realized with bitter clarity that the physical house was a lost cause. However, she was not willing to walk away empty-handed. Her greed was a bottomless, dark ocean, and her desire for vengeance was now the only thing keeping her standing. She needed a new target. She needed to find a way to inflict maximum financial devastation upon me, to ensure that even if she lost her kingdom, I would be left completely destitute in the ruins. She walked to a nearby coffee shop and sat down at a small table, ignoring the stares of the other patrons. She pulled her cell phone from her pocket. Her mind raced through the labyrinth of our family finances, searching for a vulnerable entry point. Then a cold, predatory smile slowly crept across her face. She remembered the corporate business accounts. During the final months of the life of my son, when he was too weak to manage the daily operations of his small logistics firm, I had temporarily linked several of my own corporate supply funds to his primary business accounts to ensure his employees were paid on time. I had done it out of pure fatherly devotion, to keep his legacy afloat while he suffered. Vanessa knew about those linked accounts. More importantly, she was still legally recognized as the primary executor of his personal estate. She falsely assumed that her status as his widow granted her unrestricted administrative access to the entire interconnected financial network. She believed that the digital pathways I had opened to save his business were still fully operational and completely unguarded. She did not view those accounts as the livelihood of honest employees or the culmination of my professional career. She viewed them as a massive, unprotected vault just waiting to be cracked open. Her plan formed with terrifying speed. She would not simply take what she thought was owed to her. She would drain the corporate supply funds entirely. She would wire the millions of dollars into an untraceable offshore account and completely bankrupt my operational legacy before the sun came up. She would leave me with nothing but a sprawling, empty house and a mountain of unpayable debt. She stood up from the small table, her physical exhaustion entirely erased by the thrilling prospect of total financial warfare. She used the last remaining credit on her personal card to book a room at a high-end luxury hotel just a few blocks away from the downtown financial district. She needed a secure private internet connection to execute the digital heist. She walked through the brightly lit hotel lobby, completely ignoring the concerned looks from the concierge regarding her disheveled appearance. She rode the elevator to the 15th floor and locked herself inside the pristine, quiet room. She did not take a shower or order food. She walked directly to the mahogany desk and opened the sleek hotel laptop provided for business guests. She cracked her knuckles and took a deep breath. She was preparing to launch a catastrophic strike against my entire financial existence. She believed she was sharp-witted and untouchable, completely unaware that my attorney Andrew Barnes and I had anticipated this exact pivot. We knew that when the physical door was slammed in her face, she would immediately look for a digital window to crawl through. She was not breaking into an unguarded vault. She was walking willingly into the most dangerous and heavily monitored financial snare we had ever constructed. The cold blue light from the laptop monitor cut through the darkness of the hotel room, illuminating her face. She sat perfectly still in the plush leather chair, staring at the login screen of the commercial banking portal. The initial sting of her arrest and the humiliation of the holding cell had completely vanished, replaced entirely by a thrilling, venomous anticipation. She believed she was about to execute a masterstroke of financial vengeance. She reached into her ruined designer purse and pulled out a small black notebook. Inside those pages were the master administrative passwords for the business accounts belonging to my late son. She had not acquired these passwords through any legitimate legal process. She had extracted them from Matthew during his final agonizing weeks, relentlessly pressuring him under the guise of paying minor hospital invoices. He had surrendered his digital keys simply to buy a few moments of quiet, completely unaware that he was handing her the exact tools to dismantle my entire professional legacy. She opened the notebook and began typing the complex sequence of letters and numbers with rapid, trembling fingers. Her breathing was shallow and fast. The banking system immediately prompted her for a secondary authentication code. A normal thief would have been stopped by this security measure. But she was not a normal thief. She reached back into her purse and retrieved the personal cell phone belonging to Matthew, a device she had refused to surrender to me after the funeral. The screen of the phone illuminated instantly, displaying the secure 6-digit text message generated by the bank. She copied the numbers onto the laptop keyboard and pressed the enter key. The heavy digital gates swung open without a single alarm, granting her unrestricted access to the administrative financial dashboard. The screen refreshed, displaying a pristine grid of corporate accounts. Her eyes immediately locked onto the aggregated balance of the primary supply funds I had linked to the business. The bold black numbers glowing on the screen read just over $2.4 million. Those funds represented 30 years of my hard labor. They were the lifeblood of my engineering firm, carefully accumulated to pay honest contractors purchase essential building materials, and ensure the financial security of my dedicated employees. To her, those numbers were nothing more than a massive, unprotected lottery jackpot. She did not feel a single ounce of guilt as she stared at the money. In her deeply twisted reality, she felt entirely justified in stealing it. She believed she had endured the profound inconvenience of a sick husband, and this massive fortune was her rightful compensation for playing the role of the grieving widow. She poured herself a glass of water from the carafe on the mahogany desk, sipping it slowly as a wide, predatory smile stretched across her face. She was intoxicated by her own perceived brilliance. She visualized me sitting in a cheap motel room on the edge of town, a foolish and defeated old man mourning his son, entirely unaware that the foundation of his wealth was about to be vaporized. She placed the glass down and moved the cursor directly to the tab, labeled for international wire transfers. She had no intention of moving the money to a local domestic branch where court orders could freeze the assets. She was planning a permanent, untraceable extraction. She turned to the final page of her small black notebook. Written in her meticulous handwriting were the routing details for a private offshore account located in a jurisdiction famous for its impenetrable banking secrecy laws. This was the most chilling aspect of her plan. She had not established this offshore account today in a moment of desperate panic. She had opened it quietly months ago while my son was still alive and fighting for his life. She had been carefully preparing her escape route the entire time, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. She entered the long alphanumeric sequence of the foreign routing number into the banking portal, double-checking every single digit with cold, calculated precision. She selected the primary corporate supply fund as the originating source of the massive transfer. She moved her cursor down to the empty box, designating the transfer amount. She did not consider taking a modest sum to start a new life. She did not leave enough money behind to cover the pending weekly payroll for the workers who depended on that company to feed their own families. Her greed was absolute, blinding, and all-consuming. She pressed the number 2 on the keyboard, followed deliberately by 6 consecutive zeros. $2 million. It was a financial strike so devastating it would instantly bankrupt the daily operations of the business and throw my entire professional world into absolute chaos. The commercial banking portal generated a final security review screen. A bold yellow warning message appeared at the top of the monitor. The automated text explicitly advised her that international commercial wire transfers of this extreme magnitude were strictly non-reversible once the transaction was initiated. The stark warning did not cause her to hesitate. It did not trigger any dormant sense of morality. Instead, the warning deeply encouraged her. Non-reversible was exactly the outcome she desired. She wanted the money to vanish instantly into the digital ether, completely beyond the reach of local law enforcement, federal regulators, or my team of corporate attorneys. She rested her perfectly manicured finger on the smooth surface of the laptop trackpad. The quiet hotel room felt completely isolated from the consequences of the real world. She took one final deep breath, relishing the absolute power she commanded in that single moment. With a sharp, definitive tap of her finger, she clicked the submit button. She leaned back into the plush leather chair and crossed her arms, watching the computer screen transition to a circular processing graphic. She was entirely convinced that she had just outsmarted everyone, executed the perfect, untraceable crime, and permanently secured a lifetime of stolen luxury. She had absolutely no idea that every single keystroke she had just made was being actively monitored, and the digital vault she thought she was emptying was actually the final, inescapable trap I had set for her. The heavy mahogany clock on the wall of the bank manager's office ticked with a slow, rhythmic precision. I sat in a high-backed leather chair across from a massive, polished desk. Andrew Barnes, my attorney, sat beside me with his briefcase resting quietly at his feet. The branch manager, a nervous man named Philip Reynolds, adjusted his silk tie for the 4th time in 10 minutes. His office was located on the top floor of the regional banking headquarters, far away from the busy public tellers on the ground floor. It was a room designed for quiet, high-net-worth transactions, and discreet financial conversations. But tonight, it was functioning as a digital observation deck. The large flat-screen monitor mounted on the wall opposite us was directly mirrored to the primary administrative interface of my corporate trust accounts. We were not there to conduct routine business. We were sitting in absolute silence waiting for a predator to walk blindly into a digital cage. Philip cleared his throat and wiped a thin layer of sweat from his forehead. He was a banker who preferred predictable spreadsheets and safe investments. He was clearly uncomfortable participating in a live sting operation, orchestrated in conjunction with federal authorities. Andrew remained perfectly still, his eyes locked intensely on the glowing screen. I did not feel any anxiety. I felt the same cold, focused patience of a hunter waiting for the rustle of leaves in a dark forest. I knew Vanessa was out there. I knew she was desperate and enraged. And I knew the exact moment she would try to strike. At precisely 9:14 in the evening, the quiet hum of the office was pierced by a sharp electronic chime. The large wall monitor flashed bright yellow. A new line of data appeared at the very top of the transaction ledger. Philip gasped softly and leaned forward, grabbing his computer mouse with a shaking hand. He clicked on the highlighted row, expanding the details of the incoming request. There it was. An external wire transfer initiation, originating from an untraceable public internet protocol address. The requested amount was exactly $2 million. The destination was a numbered offshore account in a notoriously uncooperative foreign jurisdiction. Philip turned his monitor toward us, his face completely pale. He began to speak rapidly, his voice trembling with professional panic. He explained that the automated security protocols had instantly flagged the transaction due to the massive dollar amount and the foreign routing number. The system had automatically placed the funds in a temporary holding status labeled as pending review. Philip looked directly at me, his eyes wide with urgency. He stated that he could press a single button right now and immediately decline the transfer. He promised me he could lock the entire corporate network, block her access completely, and secure my money within seconds. He was offering me a quick, clean escape. He was offering to shut the door before the thief could step inside. I did not nod. I did not tell him to cancel the transaction. I turned my head slowly and looked at Andrew. My attorney offered a very faint, grim smile and gave me a single subtle nod of confirmation. I looked back at the terrified branch manager and spoke in a voice that was perfectly level and devoid of any panic. I instructed him to do absolutely nothing. I told him to remove his hand from the computer mouse and sit back in his chair. Philip looked at me as if I had just lost my mind. He pleaded with me, reminding me that $2 million was an astronomical sum of money to gamble with. He warned that if the funds accidentally slipped past the secondary federal gateway, they would vanish completely into the offshore account, and no legal team on Earth could ever retrieve them. He begged me to let him decline the transfer and protect the legacy I had spent 30 years building. Andrew leaned forward and answered for me, his legal tone cutting through the nervous energy in the room like a sharp blade. He explained to the manager that if we simply declined the transaction, Vanessa would only be guilty of an attempted unauthorized access. It was a minor digital infraction that her expensive defense lawyers could easily excuse as a clerical error or a misunderstanding of her executor privileges. She would face a fine and perhaps a stern warning from a judge. She would walk away essentially unpunished and free to plot her next attack against my family. We did not want her to attempt a crime. We needed her to successfully complete the irreversible action. Andrew pointed to the glowing yellow pending status on the monitor. He explained that in order for the federal authorities to bring down the full, crushing weight of the international wire fraud statutes, the suspect must demonstrate absolute malicious intent. The suspect must believe the money has successfully left the jurisdiction. I looked at the screen, watching the little digital clock next to the transaction counting the seconds. I knew Vanessa was sitting in a hotel room somewhere, staring at her own screen, waiting for the confirmation. I was not going to deny her that satisfaction. I turned back to Philip and gave him my final unyielding directive. I authorized him to manually override the first internal security block. I instructed him to let the system generate a false confirmation receipt and send it directly back to her laptop. I wanted her to see the words transfer successful. I wanted her to feel the immense intoxicating rush of victory. But I also instructed Philip to simultaneously reroute the actual physical funds into a frozen federal escrow account, operating under the direct supervision of the banking authorities. The money would never actually leave the country. It would drop straight into a steel vault controlled by the government. Philip swallowed hard, his hand trembling as he reached for the keyboard. He typed in his executive override credentials. He clicked the approval button for the first gateway. The yellow pending status on the wall monitor instantly vanished. It was replaced by a bright green banner that read, "Processing complete." At that exact second, in a hotel room across the city, Vanessa was undoubtedly cheering and celebrating her newfound stolen wealth. She believed she had just won the war and destroyed my life forever. But as the green banner faded, a new solid red block of text appeared on our screen. The funds were secured. The trap was permanently locked. The digital footprint was preserved in absolute concrete. She had successfully transferred the money not into her own pockets, but directly into the hands of the federal prosecutors, who were now repairing the final devastating phase of her destruction. The glowing red warning on the large wall monitor cast a harsh shadow across the quiet bank office. Philip, the branch manager, exhaled heavily and wiped his sweating forehead with a white handkerchief, completely overwhelmed by the federal sting operation he had just facilitated. I sat perfectly still in my leather chair, watching the digital confirmation of the frozen transaction. The initial objective was complete. We had successfully trapped Vanessa in the act of committing massive international wire fraud. But Andrew, my trusted attorney, did not close his laptop. He had been quietly investigating the chaotic financial history of my daughter-in-law for several weeks, trying to understand the full scope of her greed. He connected his computer to the secure banking server using the offshore routing number she had just provided as a direct search parameter. The room was perfectly silent, except for the rapid rhythmic clicking of his keyboard. I watched his face closely. Andrew is a man who operates entirely on logic and cold facts, rarely showing any personal emotion. But as he scrolled through the newly decrypted data, a sudden sharp tightness appeared in his jaw. He stopped typing completely. He stared at his screen for a long, agonizing minute before he finally lifted his head to look at me. His eyes held a profound, heavy sorrow that I had never seen before. Andrew slowly turned his laptop screen toward me and pushed it across the polished mahogany desk. He pointed to a long, dense ledger of older, smaller financial transactions. He explained that federal banking systems maintain permanent indelible records of international routing numbers. When Vanessa entered that specific offshore account number to steal my corporate funds tonight, she accidentally provided the missing digital key to a dark mystery Andrew had been trying to solve since my son passed away. He opened a secondary window on his screen, displaying the detailed transaction history of the joint checking account belonging to Matthew and Vanessa. Over the past 14 months, there had been dozens of significant withdrawals. Each of these large withdrawals was manually processed and explicitly categorized in the digital ledger as specialized medical expenses. Andrew traced his pen across the screen, matching the dates and the amounts. He then showed me the destination of those older outgoing transfers. They did not go to the oncology center. They did not go to the private pharmacies or the specialized care facilities. Every single dollar went directly into the exact same offshore account she had just attempted to use tonight. I stared at the black numbers glowing against the bright white background of the monitor. My mind struggled violently to process the sheer magnitude of the evil I was witnessing. During the darkest and most terrifying days of the illness my son endured, I had quietly liquidated a substantial portion of my personal retirement savings. I had transferred hundreds of thousands of dollars into their joint account explicitly to fund an experimental treatment protocol at a prestigious private clinic. It was a highly advanced therapy that offered a genuine medical chance to prolong his life and significantly reduce his physical agony. Vanessa had eagerly volunteered to manage all the complex medical billing and insurance paperwork. She claimed she wanted to take that heavy administrative burden off my shoulders so I could simply focus on being a supportive father to my dying son. I had believed her completely. I had trusted her weeping eyes and her promises to secure the best possible care for him. The horrifying truth was now laid bare right in front of me, documented in cold, undeniable data. She never paid the private clinic. She had systematically diverted the money I sent for his survival directly into her secret overseas vault. She had allowed my son to endure the brutal, agonizing standard treatments at the underfunded public hospital while repeatedly telling me the expensive experimental therapies were simply failing to stop the disease. I remembered sitting beside his hospital bed, watching his body wither away in unimaginable pain. I remembered his shallow, terrified breathing and his quiet apologies for not being strong enough to fight the illness. I realized with a sickening, crushing clarity that Matthew had suffered immeasurably more than he ever needed to. His pain had been deliberately prolonged. His final months on this earth were a torturous nightmare, entirely because the woman sleeping in the room next to him was actively siphoning his vital lifeline to build her own stolen fortune. She had literally traded his physical comfort and his remaining days of life for cold cash. The air in the bank manager's office suddenly felt incredibly thin and suffocating. A deep, violent tremor started in my hands and quickly spread through my entire chest. I had spent the last 2 days operating with the cold, detached precision of an engineer protecting his physical assets. I had viewed her eviction from the estate and her subsequent arrest for real estate forgery as a necessary structural adjustment to protect my business and my legacy. I wanted to teach her a lesson about arrogance and boundaries, but the data illuminating that screen shattered my clinical detachment completely. This was no longer a simple dispute over a house or a stolen corporate fund. This was murder by proxy. She had tortured my only child for profit. She had watched him slowly suffocate in agony while quietly checking her offshore bank balance. I stood up from the heavy leather chair. The profound sadness that had weighed me down since the funeral completely evaporated from my soul. It was instantly incinerated by a white-hot, righteous fury. I looked at Andrew, and my voice was harder than poured concrete. I told him to immediately compile every single financial record, every digital footprint, and every corresponding fraudulent medical invoice from the past 2 years. I instructed him to forward the entire comprehensive dossier directly to the federal prosecutors and the Specialized Medical Fraud Investigative Unit. I wanted the authorities to know exactly what she had done to a vulnerable dying man. The digital trap I had set earlier that evening was originally designed to simply put her in a federal prison for corporate financial crimes. But now my objective had entirely shifted. I was going to ensure that she was buried permanently under the full crushing weight of medical exploitation and criminal neglect charges. She had maliciously stolen the last moments of peace my son could have ever experienced. I was going to make absolutely certain that she never experienced a single moment of freedom or peace for the rest of her miserable, pathetic life. The bright green confirmation banner on the hotel laptop was the most beautiful thing Vanessa had ever seen. She stared at the words indicating the successful transfer for a long time, letting the reality of her newfound immense wealth wash over her. She closed the laptop with a sharp, satisfying click. She was a millionaire 2 times over. She did not need to stay in this city anymore. She did not need to fight an old man for a brick house when she could buy a sprawling luxury villa on the coast of Spain. She gathered her ruined designer purse and walked out of the hotel room. She felt entirely untouchable. She rode the elevator down to the grand lobby, her posture straight and her chin held high, completely ignoring the concierge who had judged her disheveled appearance earlier that evening. She walked out into the cool night air and retrieved her luxury sedan from the valet. She handed the young man a crisp $50 bill from her small remaining stash of physical cash. It was the last piece of paper money she would possess for a very long time. She drove away from the downtown financial district, heading toward the dark, open stretch of the interstate highway. She planned to drive straight through the night, cross the state line, and board a first-class international flight in the morning, leaving the wreckage of my family entirely behind her. Before hitting the open highway, she realized the fuel gauge on her digital dashboard was resting dangerously near the empty symbol. She pulled the heavy luxury sedan into a brightly lit premium gas station on the desolate edge of the city limits. The harsh fluorescent lights buzzed loudly overhead as she stepped out of the car. She walked into the convenience store, intending to buy expensive bottled water and snacks for her triumphant road trip. She approached the counter and casually tossed a few overpriced items onto the surface alongside her premium platinum credit card. The young cashier scanned the items and swiped the heavy metal card through the electronic terminal. The machine beeped a harsh, flat tone. The cashier looked at the screen and politely informed her that the card was declined. Vanessa scoffed loudly, rolling her eyes at the presumed incompetence of the store equipment. She snatched the metal card back and pulled a different gold credit card from her thick leather wallet. She haughtily instructed the cashier to run the second card, blaming the first rejection on an automated fraud alert triggered by her massive international wire transfer. The cashier swiped the gold card. The machine produced the exact same flat negative tone. The cashier shook his head, stating that the terminal was returning a hard confiscation code. He explained that he was legally obligated to keep the card, but he nervously handed it back to her anyway, not wanting to provoke the visibly angry woman standing across from him. Vanessa snatched her belongings and stormed out of the brightly lit store without the water or the fuel. She marched back to her car, her pulse beginning to quicken with a strange, unfamiliar anxiety that she could not easily dismiss. She climbed into the driver's seat and slammed the heavy car door shut, locking herself safely inside the quiet cabin. She reached into her purse and pulled out her cell phone. Her manicured fingers were suddenly trembling as she opened her personal banking application. She expected to see a temporary hold message or a simple security verification request caused by the sudden movement of $2 million. Instead, the application screen loaded slowly, agonizingly, before flashing a stark white background with bold red text. The screen did not display her checking balance. It did not display her savings account. It simply read, "Account permanently frozen pursuant to federal investigation." She stared at the terrifying words, unable to comprehend their meaning. She frantically closed the application and opened the portal for her secondary credit cards. Every single account she checked displayed the exact same severe message. Her credit limit was completely erased. Her available cash was absolute zero. The entire digital financial identity tied to her social security number had been completely and systematically eradicated from the banking network. A cold, suffocating panic violently gripped her chest, making it difficult for her to draw breath. She realized she had not outsmarted anyone. The federal banking authorities had not accidentally frozen her personal accounts due to a routine technical error. They had locked her entire existence because they knew exactly what she had just done in that hotel room. The offshore wire transfer had not been a successful covert escape. It had been the final devastating piece of digital evidence required to authorize a total federal seizure of her assets. She was sitting alone in a gas station parking lot in the middle of the night, with less than a quarter tank of fuel in her vehicle. She had absolutely no access to money. Her cell phone service would inevitably be terminated within hours once the billing cycle detected the frozen accounts. She could not return to the safety of the luxury hotel because the deposit card on file would instantly decline and the electronic door lock would deny her entry. She could not buy a plane ticket to leave the country. She could not even buy a simple bottle of water to wet her dry throat. The massive, invincible empire of stolen wealth she had envisioned just 30 minutes ago had vanished entirely into thin air. She was completely stranded, isolated, and stripped of every single resource she possessed in the world. The heavy, oppressive silence of the car pressed in on her from all sides, amplifying the sound of her own rapid heartbeat. She rested her forehead against the cold leather steering wheel as the blinding realization of her complete and total doom finally settled over her. She was no longer a wealthy widow or a triumphant conqueror plotting her luxurious escape. She was a desperate, penniless fugitive trapped in a metal box, simply waiting for the inevitable sound of approaching police sirens. The bell above the glass door of the roadside diner chimed sharply, breaking the quiet murmur of the early morning breakfast crowd. I sat in a faded vinyl booth at the very back of the restaurant, nursing a cup of black coffee and a plate of plain scrambled eggs. The heavy rain from the previous night had completely washed the world outside, leaving the pavement gleaming brightly under the morning sun. I was reading a local newspaper completely at peace with the mechanical precision shot of the trap I had sprung. I did not need to check my phone or call Andrew for updates. I knew that a woman with zero financial resources and a completely suspended digital identity could only run for so long before pure desperation forced her to seek out the very person she had tried to destroy. I heard the heavy, frantic footsteps before I actually saw her. Vanessa marched down the narrow aisle of the diner, completely ignoring the waitress who tried to politely offer her a laminated menu. The patrons sitting at the breakfast counter turned their heads in collective shock as she passed. The woman who slid violently into the booth directly across from me bore absolutely no resemblance to the arrogant, immaculate widow who had whispered cruel threats at the cemetery just 2 days prior. Her expensive crimson business suit was heavily creased, stained with dried rain, and smelling faintly of gasoline and cheap car upholstery. She had clearly slept in her vehicle in some dark parking lot. Her perfectly styled hair was a chaotic, tangled mess, framing a face that was completely pale and drawn tight with absolute panic. Her dark sunglasses were missing, revealing bloodshot, terrified eyes that darted around the room with the frantic, wild energy of a cornered animal. She slammed her open palms flat against the sticky table, causing my coffee to spill slightly over the rim of the ceramic mug. She leaned across the table, invading my personal space just as she had done at the funeral. But this time she was not whispering from a position of power and perceived dominance. She was hissing through clenched teeth from a place of total, absolute ruin. She demanded that I call the federal authorities right this second and call off the hounds. She ordered me to unlock her bank accounts and drop the real estate forgery charges immediately. She spoke with a rapid, breathless cadence completely devoid of logic or reality. She still firmly believed she could simply bully her way out of a federal indictment by raising her voice and issuing demands like a spoiled child throwing a tantrum. I carefully picked up a paper napkin and wiped the spilled coffee from the table, entirely ignoring her frantic commands. My silence infuriated her further. She dug her fingernails into the table and escalated her aggressive tactics. She realized that physical intimidation and legal demands were completely useless against me, so she immediately pivoted to the only weapon she believed she had left. She chose blackmail. She lowered her voice to a venomous whisper and began to outline an intricately fabricated story she claimed she would deliver directly to the local press and the national media outlets. She threatened to completely destroy the pristine reputation of the Mitchell family name unless I surrendered the estate and the corporate funds to her control. She told me she would march straight into the offices of the largest newspaper in the city and tell them that my son was not a tragic victim of a terrible disease. She threatened to tell the world that Matthew was a corrupt businessman who used his logistics firm to launder stolen money for criminal organizations. She promised to fabricate detailed ledgers and falsified emails proving that the company was a massive illegal enterprise. She said she would paint me as the tyrannical mastermind behind the entire operation, claiming that I had forced my dying son to participate in fraud to fund my own lavish retirement. She swore she would tell the journalists that the offshore account she tried to wire the money into was actually my secret account, and she was simply trying to secure the funds to pay for his medical treatments before I stole them. She was projecting her own horrific crimes, directly onto me, spinning a web of lies so massive and scandalous that it would guarantee front-page headlines across the state. She threatened to go on television and cry for the cameras, playing the role of the terrified, abused widow who had uncovered a massive family conspiracy. She said the public loves a tragedy, but they love a scandal even more. She told me that even if the federal authorities eventually cleared my name, the court of public opinion would permanently brand me as a monster who abused his sick child. She promised that my business partners would sever all ties, my employees would resign in absolute disgust, and the legacy I had spent 30 years building would become a toxic joke in the community. She leaned back against the vinyl booth, crossing her arms over her ruined suit, a desperate, cruel smile twisting her dry lips. She asked me how it would feel to spend the last years of my life hiding inside my house, entirely alienated from the community I had helped build. She demanded a sum of $5 million in untraceable cash and a private jet charter out of the country by noon. She told me this was my one and only chance to buy her silence and protect the memory of my dead son. She believed she had finally found the pressure point that would break my resolve. She thought that a proud traditional man like me would sacrifice absolutely anything to protect the honorable name of his family from public disgrace. I watched her chest heave with the physical exertion of her frantic monologue. I did not interrupt her while she spun her intricate web of fabricated scandals. I let her speak every single malicious word. I wanted her to completely empty her arsenal of threats. I looked into her bloodshot eyes and saw nothing but a profound, terrifying emptiness. There was no grief for the husband she had just buried. There was no remorse for the pain she had inflicted on a dying man. There was only a primal, selfish desperation to escape the consequences of her own boundless greed. She was a hollow shell of a human being entirely consumed by a fire she had started herself. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my coffee. The diner around us continued its morning routine, entirely oblivious to the monumental blackmail attempt occurring in the back booth. The waitress walked by and asked if I needed a refill, pouring fresh hot coffee into my mug. I politely thanked her, keeping my eyes locked firmly on Vanessa. Her cruel smile began to falter slightly under the heavy weight of my absolute, unwavering silence. She leaned forward again, her voice cracking with sudden, terrifying doubt, demanding that I say something. She wanted me to beg. She wanted me to negotiate. She desperately needed me to validate the illusion of power she was trying to project. I carefully set my ceramic mug down on the table, placing it perfectly in the center of the brown coffee stain. I looked at her ruined clothing, her tangled hair, and the sheer, unadulterated panic radiating from her entire body. I remained perfectly calm, completely ready to deliver the final, devastating blow to her fabricated reality. The diner was filled with the clatter of silverware and the low, steady hum of morning conversations. I sat across from the woman who had just threatened to destroy my entire life, and I felt absolutely nothing but a profound, heavy peace. I did not raise my voice to defend my honor. I did not scramble to deny her vicious, fabricated accusations or beg her to reconsider her malicious plan. When you have spent your entire adult life engineering load-bearing structures, you learn to recognize when a foundation is completely solid and when it is built on shifting sand. Vanessa was screaming from a castle made of sand, and the tide had already come in to wash it all away. I looked at her ruined crimson suit, her tangled hair, and her bloodshot eyes. I picked up my ceramic mug and took one final slow sip of the black coffee, letting the bitter warmth wash over my tongue. I placed the mug back onto the saucer with a soft, deliberate click that seemed to echo loudly in the tight space of the vinyl booth. She stared at me, panting heavily from her aggressive, theatrical monologue, waiting for the panic she was so certain she had inflicted. Instead, I offered her a look of complete and utter pity. I told her that she fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the man she was trying to blackmail. I explained that blackmail only works on individuals who are desperately trying to protect a fragile public image or hold on to a specific, comfortable future. I was a 72-year-old retired widower who had just buried his only child. I had absolutely no future left to protect, and I did not care what the local newspaper printed about me. I kept my voice incredibly low and perfectly steady, forcing her to lean forward and strain her ears just to hear me over the background noise of the busy restaurant. I told her that she could march into any television station or media outlet in the state and tell them whatever horrific lies she wanted to invent. She could paint me as a criminal mastermind, and she could drag the memory of my son through the mud for the cameras. But I gently reminded her that investigative journalists require actual tangible proof before they publish front-page scandals. They would ask for the secret ledgers she promised to expose. They would ask for the falsified emails and the hidden bank records. And when she failed to produce a single piece of credible evidence because none of it actually existed, they would simply look into her own recent public background. They would easily find a woman who had just been arrested for felony real estate forgery. They would find a woman whose entire digital financial identity had been frozen overnight by a massive federal fraud investigation. I watched the arrogant, cruel smile completely vanish from her face as the cold reality of her situation began to pierce through her delusions. I told her that no one in the world would believe a single word spoken by a desperate, penniless fugitive. I informed her that the pristine family legacy she was threatening to destroy was completely untouchable by someone as utterly compromised and legally ruined as she was. She slumped back against the vinyl seat, her breathing growing incredibly shallow and erratic as the heavy walls of my logic closed in around her. But I was not finished dismantling her reality. It was time to remove the very last pillar of her false hope. She had explicitly demanded that I surrender the family estate to her control in exchange for her absolute silence. I looked directly into her terrified eyes and told her that her demand was physically and legally impossible to fulfill, even if I wanted to surrender. I explained that the blind corporate trust was not just a defensive shield designed to keep her locked out of the property. It was a fully functional legal entity capable of executing massive financial transactions without any public notice or approval. I told her that while she was sitting in a downtown holding cell and frantically trying to drain my business accounts, I had been sitting in the quiet office of my attorney, Andrew Barnes, signing a very specific stack of binding legal documents. I revealed that the sprawling brick mansion she coveted, the custom mahogany floors she had walked upon, and the pristine manicured lawns she believed she owned were no longer my property to give away. The estate had been officially and irrevocably transferred the previous afternoon. I had authorized the trust to donate the entire property deed to a renowned national pediatric cancer charity. The very house she had tried to steal was going to be converted into a residential sanctuary for families whose children were fighting the exact same disease that had slowly killed my son. I watched her mouth fall open in a silent scream of absolute agonizing realization. The physical prize she had obsessively hunted for years had been permanently converted into a monument of healing and goodwill completely beyond the reach of her bottomless greed. I had transformed the battleground into a sanctuary and left her standing alone in the ashes of her own plot. She tried to speak, but only a pathetic, strangled gasp escaped her dry throat. She had no leverage left to pull. She had no assets left to spend. She had absolutely no path forward. I slowly reached my right hand into the inside breast pocket of my tailored suit jacket. I did not rush the movement, maintaining my absolute calm. I retrieved a small rectangular digital audio recorder. The tiny red indicator light on the top of the black device was blinking with a steady, rhythmic pulse. I placed the cold metal device directly onto the center of the sticky diner table right next to my empty coffee mug. I extended my index finger and slowly, deliberately slid the active recorder across the smooth surface until it rested just a few inches away from her trembling hands. I looked at the blinking red light and then looked back up into her broken eyes. I told her that she had just spent the last 10 minutes loudly and clearly outlining a highly detailed extortion plot against a key witness in an active federal investigation. I explained that she had explicitly demanded $5 million in exchange for suppressing fabricated evidence. I informed her that I had allowed her to speak without interruption, not because I was afraid of her threats, but because I needed her to completely incriminate herself on a high-definition audio file. I kept my eyes locked on the small blinking red light of the digital device resting perfectly between our coffee cups. I explained to her in a slow, measured voice that the device was not simply recording an audio file onto a local memory card to be played back at a later date. I told her that my attorney, Andrew Barnes, was currently sitting in his downtown office alongside the lead prosecutor for the Federal Financial Crimes Division. I explained that the device was actively transmitting a live encrypted digital feed directly into their secure conference room. They had listened to every single word she had spoken since she marched frantically into the diner. They had heard her outline the fabricated media scandal with perfect clarity. They had heard her maliciously threaten to destroy my reputation and the legacy of my dead son. They had heard her explicitly demand a massive sum of untraceable cash and a private jet charter. I told her that the local district attorney did not even need to wait for a judge to issue a subpoena to acquire the evidence because she had just voluntarily delivered a pristine, uncoerced confession to multiple felony extortion charges directly into the ear of the highest-ranking law enforcement officer in the county. She stared at the small black rectangle as if it were a venomous snake coiled and ready to strike. Her mouth opened and closed several times, but her vocal cords completely refused to function. The sheer magnitude of her catastrophic miscalculation hit her with the physical force of a speeding freight train. She had walked into a public restaurant firmly believing she held the ultimate trump card of public humiliation. Instead, she had willingly handed the federal government the exact piece of concrete evidence they needed to lock her in a concrete box for the next 3 decades. I watched the last remaining shreds of her arrogant facade completely melt away. The physical transformation was deeply pathetic to witness. Her shoulders slumped heavily forward, and her entire body began to tremble violently, causing the table to shake and making the metal spoon rattle loudly against her empty coffee saucer. She reached her hands up and grabbed the sides of her tangled hair, pulling at the strands as her breathing escalated into rapid, shallow hyperventilation. The venomous predator who had slapped me with cruel demands at the cemetery and confidently marched into the courthouse to steal my family legacy was entirely gone. In her place sat a broken, terrified, and utterly defeated shell of a human being. I leaned slightly forward and outlined the exact reality of her immediate future, ensuring she understood the absolute finality of her situation. I told her that the federal wire fraud attempt from the hotel room carried a mandatory minimum prison sentence. I reminded her that the real estate forgery attempt carried consecutive state penalties that would be added to her total time. But I emphasized that attempting to blackmail and extort a primary witness in an active federal investigation demonstrated a level of malicious criminal intent that guaranteed no judge in the entire country would ever grant her leniency or offer her a favorable plea deal. I told her that her entire life was effectively over right here in this faded vinyl booth. She would never step foot inside my house again. She would never access the offshore accounts she had built with the money stolen from the medical fund of my dying son. She would spend the rest of her natural life wearing a standard-issue uniform, surrounded by cold steel bars, entirely forgotten by the world she had tried to manipulate. As the crushing weight of my words settled over her, the quiet morning atmosphere of the diner was suddenly pierced by a faint, high-pitched wail coming from the distant highway. It was a sound that started as a small, insignificant vibration in the damp morning air, but it rapidly grew louder and more defined with every passing second. Vanessa froze completely, her wide, bloodshot eyes darting toward the large plate-glass window at the front of the restaurant. The sound was not a single siren. It was a synchronized chorus of multiple emergency vehicles tearing down the wet asphalt, moving with absolute terrifying purpose. The patrons sitting at the breakfast counter stopped eating and turned their heads toward the window drawn by the rapidly escalating noise. The waitresses paused in the aisles holding their silver coffee pots, simply looking out at the street. Vanessa pushed herself back against the vinyl booth, trying to make herself as small as possible, as if she could somehow blend into the faded upholstery and disappear from existence entirely. Her chest heaved with completely unmanageable panic. She looked at the front door and then looked back at me, her eyes silently begging for a mercy she absolutely did not deserve. She wanted to run, but her legs were completely paralyzed by fear. She knew that running would only delay the inevitable by a few humiliating minutes and guarantee a violent physical takedown in the parking lot. The wailing sirens reached a deafening pitch as the bright flashing reflections of red and blue lights began to bounce aggressively off the rain-slicked pavement outside the diner window. The entire restaurant fell into a dead silence as everyone realized the police were not driving past the building but were actually slowing down to enter the property. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a crisp $20 bill, placing it neatly on the table to cover my breakfast and the coffee she had spilled. I picked up the small digital recorder, clicked the power button to end the transmission, and slid the device safely back into my inside breast pocket. I stood up from the booth, looking down at her one final time. She was weeping openly now, heavy tears ruining whatever was left of her makeup, but I felt absolutely no sympathy. I told her that I truly hoped the endless silent nights in federal prison would give her ample time to calculate the true cost of her boundless greed. I turned my back on her, leaving her sobbing uncontrollably in the corner booth. I walked calmly down the center aisle of the diner, ignoring the confused stares of the other customers. I pushed open the heavy glass door and stepped out into the cool, fresh morning air, just as the first massive county police cruiser turned violently into the parking lot, blocking all the exits and completely sealing her fate. The architecture of a federal courthouse is intentionally designed to make a human being feel incredibly small. The ceilings are impossibly high, and the walls are paneled in heavy dark oak that seems to absorb all sound and light. I sat alone in the very back row of the spectator gallery, resting my hands quietly on my lap. I wore a simple dark suit out of respect for the solemnity of the judicial process, but I felt no grief. The air in the courtroom was sterile and completely devoid of the chaotic emotional energy that Vanessa used to weaponize against my family. In this room, there were no screaming matches and no dramatic theatrical performances. There was only the cold, relentless, crushing machinery of the law. I watched the heavy side door of the courtroom swing open, and two armed federal marshals stepped into the room. They were escorting the woman who had once demanded the keys to my entire kingdom. The physical transformation of my daughter-in-law was absolute and deeply jarring. She was no longer wearing the tailored crimson business suit or the expensive floral perfume she used to project her false superiority. She was dressed in a standard-issue faded orange canvas jumpsuit that hung loosely from her shrinking frame. Her wrists were securely locked in heavy steel handcuffs attached to a thick chain wrapped tightly around her waist. Her ankles were shackled, forcing her to walk with a slow, humiliating shuffle that echoed loudly against the polished marble floor. Her perfectly styled hair was flat and dull, pulled back tightly away from her pale, sunken face. She looked completely hollowed out by her time in the county detention center. She was entirely stripped of the luxurious armor she had bought with the money stolen from my dying son. She was directed to sit at the heavy wooden defense table next to an exhausted public defender who looked incredibly burdened by the massive stack of evidence files resting in front of him. Because all of her personal and corporate accounts had been completely frozen by the federal authorities, she could not afford to hire the aggressive, high-powered legal team she had constantly threatened me with. She was entirely at the mercy of the public system she used to mock. The federal judge entered the courtroom, and the gallery rose in silent respect. When the judge began to read the formal indictment, The sheer volume of her crimes filled the massive room with a terrifying weight. The lead prosecutor stood up and calmly outlined the comprehensive timeline of her destruction. He detailed the deliberate falsification of the quitclaim deed, highlighting her attempt to steal the protected corporate trust property. He read the exact banking codes related to her failed attempt to wire $2 million into an untraceable offshore account. But the most devastating moment came when the prosecutor introduced the digital audio file I had recorded at the diner. He did not play the recording out loud, but he submitted the certified transcript of her unhinged extortion attempt directly into the official court record. He meticulously outlined how she had maliciously threatened to fabricate a media scandal to destroy my family legacy unless I paid her $5 million in untraceable cash. He then connected all of these aggressive actions to the darkest revelation of all, exposing her systematic theft of the medical funds I had provided for my son. The judge adjusted his glasses and looked down at Vanessa from his elevated bench. He began to list the mandatory minimum sentencing guidelines for each individual federal charge. The numbers fell from his mouth like heavy stones. 20 years for international wire fraud, 10 years for extortion, 15 years for felony real estate forgery and medical exploitation. The penalties were designed to be served consecutively, meaning one sentence would not begin until the previous one was entirely finished. The exhausted public defender did not even attempt to argue for a reduction or request bail. He simply stood silently accepting the mountain of undeniable evidence. Vanessa sat perfectly still in her wooden chair, staring blankly at the polished surface of the defense table. The realization of her absolute powerlessness finally broke the last remaining piece of her fractured mind. She was facing the rest of her natural life locked inside a maximum security federal penitentiary. She slowly turned her head and looked over her shoulder, scanning the empty wooden benches of the spectator gallery, until her eyes finally locked onto mine. She was searching for a single flicker of sympathy. She desperately wanted the old foolish father who used to pay all her bills to rescue her from the abyss. But I offered her absolutely nothing. The heavy wooden gavel fell with a sharp, echoing crack, sealing her permanent remand to federal custody and finalizing the absolute end of her reign of terror. The sharp echo of the wooden gavel was still fading into the high vaulted ceiling of the courtroom when the two armed federal marshals stepped forward to collect their prisoner. They moved with practiced mechanical efficiency, grasping Vanessa by the arms to lift her from the heavy wooden defense table. This was the precise moment she broke the strict courtroom protocol. She dug the rubber soles of her standard-issue canvas shoes into the polished marble floor, resisting their physical pull just long enough to twist her upper body around. She entirely ignored the stern verbal commands of the federal officers and locked her desperate bloodshot eyes directly onto mine across the vast, empty space of the spectator gallery. She was no longer looking for a financial rescue or a legal miracle because she knew those structural options were permanently destroyed. She was looking for a human reaction. She wanted to see a triumphant sneer, a flash of bitter vindication, or even a hateful scowl. She desperately needed me to demonstrate some form of passionate anger, because anger would indicate she still possessed the power to manipulate my emotional state. Anger would mean she still existed as a significant entity within my universe. I denied her even that tiny microscopic sliver of satisfaction. I remained seated in the back row for a long, quiet moment, simply looking back at her. My face was a completely blank, impenetrable mask of stone. I did not feel the burning rush of victory that I had expected to feel when I first packed my leather duffel bag and left the estate days ago. I did not feel the heavy, suffocating weight of my grief anymore either. Looking at the pathetic, trembling woman wrapped tightly in heavy steel chains, I felt absolutely nothing. She had become a complete and total void. Forgiveness is a beautiful, sacred gift reserved exclusively for those who demonstrate genuine remorse and actively seek redemption. Anger is a heavy emotional tax you pay to people who still matter to your future. Vanessa qualified for neither of these things. She had permanently forfeited her right to occupy a single square inch of my mind or my heart. I slowly placed my hands on the solid wooden pew in front of me and stood up. I took a brief moment to carefully adjust the lapels of my dark suit, smoothing out a small, invisible wrinkle near the bottom buttons. I executed these mundane physical actions with deliberate, relaxed precision, entirely ignoring the frantic, desperate energy she was projecting toward me from across the vast room. I did not offer a nod of final goodbye. I did not mouth a silent curse or a parting insult. I simply finished adjusting my jacket, turned my body 90 degrees, and directed my unwavering gaze toward the heavy double doors leading out to the public hallway. As I began to walk down the center aisle, I could hear the sharp, metallic clattering of her heavy ankle shackles dragging across the stone floor as the federal marshals finally lost their patience and forcefully guided her toward the secure side exit. I heard her voice crack as she desperately called out my name one final time, a pathetic, strained whisper echoing through the silent, cavernous room. Her voice was completely stripped of its former venom and boundless arrogance, leaving only the raw, primal terror of a woman stepping directly into a permanent, endless nightmare. I did not break my steady stride. I did not pause my deliberate steps, and I absolutely did not turn my head to look back over my shoulder. Looking back would acknowledge her pathetic plea. Looking back would validate her existence in my world. I kept my eyes focused entirely on the polished brass handles of the exit doors ahead of me. Every single step I took down that long, carpeted aisle severed another invisible string connecting me to the darkest period of my entire life. I was not just walking out of a federal courthouse building. I was walking out of the twisted, toxic labyrinth she had meticulously constructed around my family. The heavy wooden doors swung open easily under my firm push. I stepped out of the dark, oppressive atmosphere of the courtroom and into the brightly lit public corridor. The heavy wooden doors swung shut automatically behind me, cutting off the pathetic sound of her dragging chains with a definitive final thud. I walked past the security checkpoints and the busy administrative clerks moving steadily toward the grand main entrance of the building. The air grew significantly lighter and easier to breathe with every passing second. I reached the massive glass exit doors and pushed them open, stepping out onto the wide concrete steps of the courthouse plaza. The morning sun was incredibly bright, washing over the bustling city streets with a warm, cleansing golden light. I took a deep, long breath of the crisp air. The absolute severance was completely finalized. The woman who had tried to steal my kingdom and destroy the legacy of my son was permanently erased from my reality, leaving me completely free to navigate the rest of my life in absolute quiet peace. 6 months have passed since the heavy wooden doors of the federal courthouse swung shut. I am sitting on the wide wrap-around porch of a sturdy cedar cabin nestled deep in the Blue Ridge Mountains. The morning air here is incredibly crisp and clean, completely free of the stifling humidity and the toxic memories that haunted my old estate. I hold a simple ceramic mug filled with dark roast coffee, watching the thick white mist slowly roll off the deep green pines. A pair of red-tailed hawks circles high above the tree line, riding the invisible thermal currents. The profound silence of the mountain is not the heavy, oppressive silence of a lonely, empty mansion. It is the steady, comforting silence of a life that has been completely rebuilt on a foundation of absolute truth. I do not miss the sprawling brick house or the imported marble countertops. I do not miss the grand foyer where my daughter-in-law once paraded her unearned arrogance. Those things were merely physical structures built to house a dream that never actually existed. Here in this modest cabin surrounded by the raw beauty of nature, I have finally found the genuine peace that completely eluded me for the past decade. The corporate business funds that Vanessa tried so desperately to steal are no longer sitting idle in commercial accounts. Following the complete resolution of the federal investigation and the permanent freezing of her illicit offshore assets, I sat down with my attorney, Andrew Barnes, to restructure my entire financial legacy. We established the Matthew Mitchell Memorial Grant, a fully endowed medical foundation designed specifically to fund advanced experimental treatments for patients battling the exact same aggressive illness that claimed the life of my son. The $2 million she attempted to wire out of the country in the middle of the night is now actively paying for specialized therapies, private clinic stays, and comprehensive care for families who are drowning in the exact same medical debt that she used as a weapon against my child. Every single month, I sit at my small wooden dining table and read letters from grateful parents and exhausted spouses, thanking the foundation for giving them a few more precious months with their loved ones. I read stories of fathers who can finally afford pain management medication, and mothers who do not have to choose between buying groceries and paying for chemotherapy. By doing this, I have completely erased the dark stain of her boundless greed from the memory of my son. Matthew will not be remembered as the weak, dying man who forged a property deed under the crushing pressure of an abusive, manipulative wife. He will be permanently remembered as the namesake of a foundation that brings genuine hope to the desperate. I took the profound, agonizing pain of his prolonged suffering and engineered it into a permanent structural support system for others. His tragedy has been transformed into a powerful engine of healing. Sitting here on this quiet mountain, I often reflect on the true nature of love and sacrifice. For my entire life, I operated under the flawed assumption that being a good father meant enduring absolutely any indignity to provide for my child. I believed that unconditional love required unconditional surrender. I willingly handed over my home, my finances, and my daily comfort, completely ignoring the toxic environment that was actively poisoning my own existence. I falsely equated suffering in silence with strength. I have finally learned that true love should never require the complete destruction of your own dignity. A genuine family is not simply defined by shared genetics or signed marriage certificates. It is defined by mutual respect, unwavering loyalty, and the fundamental understanding that a parent is a human being, not a limitless financial resource to be drained and discarded. By walking away from her unreasonable demands at the cemetery and allowing her to face the devastating consequences of her own actions, I did not abandon my family. I simply established a rigid, impenetrable boundary around my own self-worth. I stopped acting as a human shield for a person who secretly wished for my demise. The greatest victory I achieved was not watching her walk out of that courtroom in heavy steel chains. I take no genuine joy in knowing she will spend the rest of her life in a federal penitentiary. The true justice was completely reclaiming my own life from the wreckage she created. I am 72 years old, and for the first time in a very long time, I am entirely free to breathe. Thank you for listening to my story today. If you found value in this journey, please let me know by leaving a comment below and telling me which city you are watching from. Remember to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more life stories about resilience, setting boundaries, and reclaiming your personal power. Never let anyone diminish your worth or convince you that your kindness is a weakness. See you in the next video.